I'm Tim, the Brand Weaver, and this is Branding for Breweries, the podcast that helps you grow your brewery, build a better brand, and connect with more drinkers. Each week, I'm joined by the brightest minds in the beer world, sharing practical tips to help your brewery stand out and sell more beer. Let's get stuck in. What up, 24-hour party people? 'Tis I, Tim the Brand Weaver, back once again with another exciting episode of Branding for Breweries for your earballs, and if you're watching this live, your eyeballs as well. And before we get stuck in, a massive shout out to Charles Fareham, the brand new show sponsor, who have told me that they're working on something very exciting for the low nose space. It's a new exciting yeast strain, and if I read my notes right, it's LA02 or O2, depending on where you're listening to it from. And they've got some terpentine-based aroma systems like Abstract's Alterp. That sounds exciting. I hope I read it right. But if not, you can go to the website, check it out, and get involved. They'll be happy to talk to you. That's enough about Charles Fareham and the team. Let's talk about our guest today. It is the phenomenal Matt and Laura from the Portman Group. They reached out to me after a show that I had a while ago where the Portman Group was kind of addressed and talked about and how you navigate and work with them. And they said, I tell you what, Tim, why don't we come onto the show? Why don't we give you even a little bit more information to help all you wonderful brewery folk out? So that's what we're going to do. So everyone put your hands together digitally for Matt and Laura. Hello, guys. How are you doing?
Hi there, Tim. How are you doing?
Hiya.
Good.
Are you both feeling good?
All good, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, very good.
Yes.
Amazing stuff. Well, thank you very much for joining me. Of course, this is a three-way conversation, so lots of voices in the room, but this is very exciting nonetheless. I suppose before we get stuck into the big burning questions, maybe, Matt, would you be kind enough to give us a little bit of an overview about the Portman Group for those listeners who might not be familiar with you?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. So the Portman Group is the regulator for all parts of the United Kingdom for marketing of alcoholic products and sponsorship. And it's also the drinks responsibility body. So it's also about encouraging the drinks industry to do the right thing. We're very much for standing up for the right of people to enjoy a drink in moderation and for companies to do the right thing, ideally on a voluntary basis. And it goes back, a bit over 35 years, Tim. In 1989, the government of the day, it was kind of like the tail end of Mrs. Thatcher, John Major time, so way back for most of your listeners and viewers, I guess. But they basically started to worry about alcopops, and they said to the drinks industry, either you regulate and sort this out or we'll regulate. And back in the day, the industry sort of leaders at the time got together and said, we must do something about this. And they set up, first of all, a drinks responsibility body. And this year, we're celebrating 30 years of what then became the code of practice for the Portman Group. So this is the 30th year anniversary. It's literally been, Portman Group's a bit older and been trying to do the right thing and encourage the drinks industry to do the right thing. But that was formalized in a code of practice. And the decisions on that, although we're funded by the industry, 21 companies, a lot of large players, but quite a few smaller players too, and over 200 code signatories. Many of your listeners and viewers, if they're in the brewing industry, will be code signatories of the Portman Group, and if they're not and they want to, just get in touch with us. We'll give you the details at the end of the show and tell you how to do that. But most people can get behind it, but the code applies really to everybody, regardless of whether they want to be regulated or not. It is the official regulator for, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland of marketing and sponsorship. And the decisions of complaints, which generally speaking come from the public, sometimes from public bodies. Companies can raise complaints against others if they wish to. But we have an independent complaints panel, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I'll tell you a little bit about that later on in the show, but it's separate from us, but we are the secretariat and support for that. But the Portman Group provides guidance to the industry. We provide a completely free advisory service, and we'll happily tell you a little bit about how that works and the kind of things that we give it, the kind of free advice on to anybody who wants it for no cost. And we also provide some low-cost training, which will go into much more detail about how we work. Last thing I want to say about that, Tim, really, in this sort of introduction is, we're not the fun police. We're we're here to work with industry, and we try to work with them positively. We do have a kind of big stick that we can beat people with, but we really don't want to do that, and we try to use that as rarely as possible. And it's something we hate to do. Really, the much better thing is to work cooperatively with the industry, and generally speaking, we have a pretty good relationship with the industry, actually, large and small.
Fantastic. Well, I mean, congratulations on 30 years. That's pretty impressive. I had no idea that had been going for so long. But I suppose if we address the elephant in the room, Matt, you touched on it just there. Like the Portman Group, when it's come up in conversations, it's got this kind of big bad wolf enemy stigma to it. Oh, they are using that big stick to hit the little guy down. Laura, what do you want people to understand about the Portman Group? Why has it all gone so wrong?
Yeah, so I think where's it gone wrong? I think actually, as you highlighted it in the episode preview, Tim, for some, when they see that Portman Group name, they think something has gone wrong. And I was having a think about this in general life, really. I think we've all been in that situation where you've had a letter pop through your letterbox, and it's either got the DVLA on it or it's got HMRC in it, and your heart sinks. Most of those times, those letters are admin, but we're all human, and I think sometimes your mind just goes to the worst place. You think something has gone seriously wrong, and I think for some, these brands are their livelihoods. Sometimes even their identities are put into the brands, and it can feel personal, and I completely understand that. I think what we'd want people to know is that the process is not personal. There's a step-by-step guide that is in the code of practice that will explain exactly what's happening during the complaints process. A lot of people think that it's the Portman Group making those complaints. In actual fact, we can't make complaints. They're usually from members of the public, as Matt's just highlighted. And the other thing I'd say to producers as well is a complaint doesn't necessarily mean that you've breached the code. Quite a lot of the time, there is that reaction where producers kind of start from a starting point where they think that's it. They've kind of from the starting point think, well, it's a problem. But a complaint does not mean it's a problem. Everyone has a chance to put their side across, and it's an independent panel that will consider that, which Matt's mentioned. So we try to spend a lot of time, a lot of our resource actually getting out into the industry so that people know of the Portman Group before a complaint is ever received. So hopefully that is not their first experience of us, because as Matt's just highlighted, there is so much more to us than just the complaint side.
Fair. I think that makes sense. I mean, ultimately, that's what this show is about. You've already touched on a number of things, but we could go through this in a little bit more detail around some common mistakes, and hopefully it can be a really helpful resource for the audience. Matt, earlier on, you touched on an advisory service that the Portman Group offer. How does that work, and when is it best used?
Well, look, it's very easy to use. You can find it on our website. You can find, there's a phone line, or you can communicate with us, email us and drop us a line that way. And basically, how it works is that if you're launching a new product, or you're launching a new marketing campaign for an existing product, or you're changing an existing product, it's a really good idea when you're at the early stages of design of that, just to pick up the phone or communicate with Laura's advisory team, and you'll find they're very easygoing, they're very helpful, they want to help you do the best, and you can share completely confidentially your designs, your plans, your thinking, how you're going to run that campaign, or how you're going to craft that label, and they will give you advice which is it's not 100% protection against a complaint that, say, you introduce that product into the market, somebody doesn't like it, they complain about it. Eventually, if the panel want to uphold a decision about it and take a different view from the advisory panel, they can. But here's the thing about the advisory panel. They know all the precedents. Laura, myself, and some of the members of the regulatory team sit in on the decisions of the independent complaints panel, so we know the way they think, and we produce the guidelines and the guidance that goes out to the public. So we've got a really good idea of, generally speaking, what flies. It's not, as I say, it's not binding on that panel because they are completely independent and they can make their own decision. But it's a pretty good guide, and it's not foolproof, but it's pretty sensible thing to do if you're launching a new product. And it's a really good way, essentially, to avoid getting yourself into trouble and that sort of email that lands in your inbox or the letter that drops on the mat that Laura was talking about. I mean, I should just say a bit about that, actually, Tim, just pivoting a little bit. We come back to the advisory service. But when I joined the Portman Group, which was about 5.5 years ago, I came from a background, I've been working for some very large businesses, and I'd also run some small businesses. And I sort of discovered, to my horror, that quite a lot of people, probably some people listening or watching today, particularly from the sort of brewing sector or craft brewing sector particularly, really, really hated the Portman Group. And I thought, well, what is that about? And I heard these sort of horror stories in the sort of corporate memory of the Portman Group of going to like Beer-X and having cans chucked at the CEO of the Portman Group. Oh, so I kind of like reached out to the Small Industry Brewers Association, SEBA, and I said, look, I understand we're at war, but maybe we could have a chat about that and find out what's going on here. And actually, a lot of this is actually, if you show a human face and you actually show up willing to find compromise or discuss, an approach, you can very quickly change the weather in those kind of relationships. And we have a great relationship with SEBA, who endorse our best practice guidelines on labelling, for example, now, and we're regular attenders at Beer-X and a lot of other industry expos and trade fairs and so forth. Key thing, I want people to understand about the Portman Group. The advisory service is there to help. The Portman Group is a pro-growth regulator run by many people who've experience of running businesses, and they understand what it's like to be regulated. I do. I come from a bunch of different industries, but they were all pretty heavily regulated. And, sometimes I get that. That is frustrating. But the way better thing to do is to work positively with the regulator, try to find out make sure you understand the rules before you get into trouble and avoid that trouble. And that's just a much more harmonious and responsible way to run businesses, particularly in the alcohol sector, because at the end of the day, we're here to help industry do the right thing. But the main thing that the Portman Group is here to do is to protect consumers. And people might question that or say, this is a bit heavy-handed sometimes, but we're not a heavy-handed regulator. We're a pro-growth regulator that wants businesses to succeed. We don't want to crush innovation. And we understand, I've run some small businesses where, the cleaner doesn't turn up, you've got to get the mop out and do it yourself. Everybody, you're in that position when you're running a small business and you're trying to break through. And I understand, it's a highly competitive sector. You're trying to get noticed if you're going to get into a retail environment on a very busy set of shelves in the drinks aisle with a lot of other products competing for eyeballs and people to come and pick up that product and hopefully put it in their trolley. That is a tough business environment, and trying to get noticed and is difficult. So there is a tendency or an inclination sometimes to cut corners and say we'll do something outrageous that gets us noticed, or we'll do something eye-catching that bends the rules or runs close to the wind on the rules. It's really not the greatest idea. There are plenty of ways of having innovative, eye-catching, exciting marketing which are within the rules. And coming back to the advisory service, working with us is a really good way to find out where that line is and get it right.
And I suppose, the advisory service sounds great. I know breweries are time sensitive, of course. If they're trying to get something through, they've got to get artwork signed off. Is that not like a sticking point? Like, Laura, if someone came to you in the team and said, okay, here it is, are they then going to be expecting to have to wait, a week, 2 weeks to get feedback?
Not at all. So we try to provide advice within 48 hours. That is our standard SLA. They'll try and do it in 24 as well. So, the team are very used to working within those tight time frames. It's their bread and butter. It's what they do. I think to speed up the process, even within the 48 hours, it's always really helpful if people can send front and back labels, because they'll always be considering the packaging in its entirety. So if you send everything upfront. Also give a bit of an explanation of your design, the brand, any thinking around it, so that can help inform the advisory services advice. But even then, once that first piece of advice is provided, people can come back time and time again. There is no limit on how many times you can use the advisory service, and it is completely free.
And so you're saying like submit the whole design. So that would suggest that you want to take a can label, for example. That's to the point of going, yes, everyone is really happy about this, and we're going to get it to the Portman Group for their quick review and thumbs up. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. So that's the ideal point. You've kind of gone through all of your internal design, and even if you've reached a stage where we have this quite often, where you've got 2 or 3 designs and you're trying to narrow it down between those 3, we can still provide advice on multiple versions of the same product. If that's what someone would like, happy to do that as well.
Okay. So then,
and the other thing, Tim, is that, I mean, they're incredibly discreet, because, I mean, Laura sitting there actually knows probably most of the products and most of the marketing campaigns that are coming up in the next 6 months. But, I can't even get that information out of her. They're very, very tight-lipped. If you try and get anything out of them, they're completely confidential. And, that's a great thing, really.
Well, yeah, I'm guessing, you don't want anyone going, hey, you'd never guess what this brewery's going to be doing next month. I'd like that information, but I know I'm not going to get it, so I'll move on. But Laura, I suppose being a designer myself as well, like there would be the fear factor of going, right, we're going to send it to the Portman Group and we're going to get a whole host of changes and it's going to set us back. Like, how often are the changes actually like super big redesigns versus a smaller, simpler thing?
So the majority of the time, honestly, about 90%, the changes will be small, very small fixes rather than full redesigns. It's often just small tweaks that are needed. And in terms of the advice that we provide, I think it's also, we have a very good understanding of the code, the guidance, the precedent that sits behind it. But fundamentally, we work in a regulator. We are not designers. So we don't give prescriptive advice to the point where we will advise on how your design can look better or anything like that. So it's helpful for us to know the brand identity, so that when we're trying to suggest changes, how to comply with the code, it's much more broad, so that design and those creativity choices still stay with the producer. And I think the majority of the time it's small changes, because in my experience at least, the majority of producers aren't setting out to breach the code. As an age-restricted product, most producers aren't trying to get under 18s to buy their product, because they can't buy their product. That's not their market. They're not trying to deliberately mislead people as to whether it's alcoholic or not. They want people to know it's alcohol because that is their product. That's their selling point, and that's reflected in the majority of what we see. The 10%, which might be a name change or a complete redesign, are very, very rare. And in those cases, again, the breaches, and this is actually mainly the advisory service, we don't see this actually in the complaint side. The breaches can be so egregious. Sometimes you do sit and wonder whether they knew what they were doing. I won't lie. But for the majority, it's really small changes.
Okay. And so obviously I used a can label as an example. Like, how much does the Portman Group cover? Like, I know in past conversations we've talked about like on-store, signage and things like that. What is your remit? What should people be running past you?
So in broad terms of remit, we will cover everything that the Advertising Standards Authority and Ofcom don't cover. Being more specific, it will be naming, packaging, promotion, sampling activities and sponsorship, as Matt's highlighted, where the activity is producer-led, producer-controlled, if they've had a say in any of those designs, or they've paid for it, for instance. So yeah, in one of our previous conversations, we were talking about point of sale material, and I think that's probably an area that's got a bit of confusion around it as to whether it's regulated or not regulated. So point of sale is regulated by the Portman Group. So thinking about shelf markers or end of unit displays, the design of those, if a producer has designed it or they've had sign off, they've worked with a retailer, that will be within our remit. The placement of such end of shelf displays or shelf markers, where it ends up, is not in our remit, because that will be retailer led. So anything that is wholly retailer led won't fall within our regulatory remit.
Okay.
Yeah,
So,
and just if I can add one other, Laura, that's sometimes people don't realise pump clips come under the Portman Group's remit. So we had a case, about 3 years ago, was Twickenham Brewery's Naked Ladies, and the pump clip was, subject of an independent complaints panel decision. Anything, and to come back to Laura's point, if the producer's got control over it, if the pub decided on the pump clip, I guess that would be out of remit. But if it's clearly the producer's name, product, and they've designed it, that's in our remit.
That's where it goes. So breweries need pubs designing the pump clips for them. They just get to choose it. No.
Do you know, I was going to say it's really rare on the pump clip side. I think we've had 3 in the entirety of our history, because
Okay.
It's much smaller space.
It's super limited real estate. I know I struggle with that designing.
Yeah.
We can't get much on. Okay, so let's get into the nuts and bolts of this. Like, where do breweries go wrong? Like, what are the common issues? Because if we can reel off those common ones, I'm hoping it's going to save a lot of people mistakes down the line. So where do we begin?
Well, what do you think, Laura? A particular appeal to under 18s is probably the big one. That's the one we see a lot of problems with, really.
Yeah, I'd say particular appeal to under 18s and communication of a product's alcoholic nature. So ironically, the two where you could probably say they're more inadvertent breaches, because it's not really in a producer's interest to breach those code rules, but they do tend to be the two that we see the most on the panel side and on the advisory service side. And I think, as Matt kind of highlighted earlier, you've got a starting point where those producers are trying to enter quite a saturated market. As a brewer, you want to create something that is different. You want to stand out on shelf. And we just spoke about a pump clip being a small space. A can is still a relatively small space to convey your entire brand identity. And that's a really difficult starting point. So in the past, I think on the alcoholic nature side, we've sent you some examples, but it's fine if you can't pull them up right now, because I'm probably going to talk out of order now. Sorry, just to be annoying. Okay. We've seen some examples such as Pojala or Rainbow Sherbet Sour.
I've got that one. Let me bring that up on screen so anyone watching can have a look.
And everything is available on our website as well, if you ever want to take a look. So for Rainbow Sherbet Sour, you've got quite a bright, busy design there. And I think for some of the cases that we've seen, ironically, to try and distinguish themselves from other alcoholic products, some people then try to disassociate themselves with alcohol just a bit too much. And it can become quite difficult to tell whether the product is alcoholic. Now, there's a balance to be had, I think, under 3.1. So the code doesn't assume that people were born, yesterday. We understand that people will pick a product up, they'll assess it in its entirety. The panel is mindful that, the average consumer, I think the definition is someone who is reasonably well informed, reasonably observant, and circumspect. So yeah, people can read, they'll have a look at it, but I think there's a balance to be had. And that balance sometimes needs to go a bit further if the packaging is innovative or it has a really busy design, and there's the potential that a consumer might, be misled or confused about product's alcoholic nature. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add there, Matt.
No, I mean, I think the thing is, Tim, the code is really 12 points of common sense, really, as I said. And I always try and describe 12 points of common sense, and it's adjudicated by 10 people applying common sense to a common sense code, really. And then you get these kind of fine lines where it's potentially complicated. And as Laura says, sometimes you can tell when people are just doing it to kind of make a point and stand out. And there have been cases like that. Some really egregious ones where I don't think we got the example, but it's not in a brewing sense. But for example, we've had a couple of spirits products produced in machine guns, right? Bottles the shape of a machine gun. Mm-hmm. Or again, I'm going to take one from outside the brewing side here, which we don't have this example, but trying to shock Foking gin which sort of claimed to be a street in Hong Kong, FOK HING gin, Foking gin. It, that was a good example of a company trying to sort of nod and a wink. And I think we have a good example in Rubble Sexy Lager, which I think you do have the example of, and I can describe for those who can't see. So Rubble Sexy Lager goes back a bit really to I think 2007, and this was an attractive young woman in a bathing suit, and the gimmick was you could scratch off the bathing suit, and the panel saw through that immediately as it's a breach of the code for actually sort of association with sexual activity as it now, but in those days it was association with sexual success, which potentially was a bit of a stretch, but the panel saw that they were being played, and it was completely unacceptable on a whole range of different levels really. That's kind of a good example of a really egregious, deliberate example. And then you get plenty, for example, I'll give you a really good example that they're happy for me to talk about, is Beak Brewery, which is run by a guy called Danny Tapper down in Lewes in West Sussex. And Beak is a really good example of a company that came up with some bright, interesting artwork. Some of it inadvertently, I think, genuinely had a particular appeal to minors. Just have to be a bit careful how I explain this, but they're using sort of stylistic, artistic cartoon imagery. For example, one of those products, which you can see there, for those who can see, has got a sort of sun, looks a bit like something out of the Mr. Men or even Teletubbies behind a rain cloud, which is, they're both anthropomorphized, I should explain. And, it's undeniably, as a piece of art, if it was a kid's design intended for kids, really pretty and attractive, eye-catching, particularly for children. And yet equally alongside that, you've got a product where it was much less clear-cut and, also effectively artistic cartoon imagery of a bunch of adults. And there, the difference was the panel felt that was sort of a more adult themed cartoon. So these kind of things, they're not absolutely, I don't necessarily want to get into the detail of that. And if people want to know more about that, there's plenty of guidance about what constitutes particular appeal. But these are good examples of a company which had tried to actually stand out on the shelf or in the pub, but had inadvertently crossed a line with some of its products, but not all. And it was really interesting because I took the panel down to see Danny down in the brewery in West Sussex, particularly because I wanted him to understand what it felt like when the Portman Group comes calling, because Danny had told. So I should explain that Laura and I always make a point, when a case is closed, we can have certain types of conversations during a case, but obviously the decisions are those that belong to the independent complaints panel, and we can't influence them, but we can provide information on process, and we can make sure company has a fair chance to make their case to the panel and defend their product from the complaint. Yeah, but once the case is closed and we have to try and find out how to actually implement the decision, if it's an upheld decision, hopefully the company will just take the medicine and apply the changes that they need to make the product acceptable in the code, and we can help them work with that. And 99 out of 100 times that's what happens. The company will just say, okay, we fair cop, and they'll sit down with my team, and particularly with Laura and her team, and we'll work out how to make that product compliant. But sometimes they will, for want of a better term, stick two fingers up at the Portman Group and say, we're not having it. And that's what I was talking about right at the beginning, about in extremis, Tim, we would introduce a retail alert bulletin, and most retailers in this country will take that product off the shelves, and then very occasionally you'll get might be a small microbrewery or a micro distillery, for example. We've had examples of this where they're literally selling out of the back of a garage or out of a cell phone shop. We can get licensing officers to go and have a knock on the door and say you're in breach of your licensing obligations because the Portman Group code is mentioned in the notes of the Licensing Act, and the guidance of the Licensing Act. So we have that very strong teeth, really. Products are not immediately taken off the shelf. The retailers would be allowed to sell through in that extreme example. But after that, they won't place any more orders. So it's a pretty strong sanction. And it's because it's such a strong sanction that it's absolutely the last resort. And honestly, we regard it as a bad day at the office when we have to apply those retail alert bulletins, and they're pretty rare. We had at least a couple of years in my time at the Portman Group when we managed to avoid doing that by working constructively with the companies. But when you do go and sit down and have those conversations, sometimes the owner or the CEO or founder of the business absolutely spitting teeth, they're furious. But we always have a better conversation at the end. And at the end of that meeting, we have 100% success rate so far. I hope it continues, where we basically shaking hands and they actually understand. It's far better that you have, my team who want to work with them constructively, help them to do the right thing, making those decisions, than, for example, a faceless civil servant sitting in Whitehall deciding, exactly what the product looks like, what font, how much of a box of this kind of information should be on the back of it, and so on, and not thinking about how do they make their business a success but stay within the rules. And I think that's kind of critical. And when we first got in touch with Danny Tapper down at Beak Brewery, he literally told me, when I got that knock on the door, I literally felt sick. I thought I was going to be sick, and I really wanted our panel to understand that, because although they're completely independent and I have to apply this code independently and so forth, I want them to understand what the consequences of the decisions are and how important they are, just as my team do, and why we take our responsibility to protect consumers so seriously, and why we want responsible producers, actually all producers, the vast majority of whom don't need telling, basically, because they are doing the right thing or they're working with our team anyway. But I wanted them to understand why it's so important to do the right thing and to protect consumers. It's not trivial, but we should do it in a sort of human way that takes on board what the consequences of those decisions are, even if they have to be pretty tough medicine, if you like.
Of course. I want to come back to the Beak example very quickly, because I understand, if I bring it back up on screen, Matt, you very kindly described, of course, we've got this sun hugging the clouds, and it could look like it's out of Mr. Men. What was the solution for this? How did you proceed and make it right? Or how did the brewery proceed and make it right?
Yeah, well, Beak is a good case study because they've actually sat down with us and changed a lot of this artwork, and I think they had a pretty well recognized artist help them design this artwork. I can't remember exactly the name. My apologies to Danny and the Beak team if they're listening, because I know a lot of thought had gone into that. Laura, do you know exactly how they changed it? Because I think your team was more involved in that than I was.
We were, but this will come back to the advisory service. Advice is always confidential, so I can't ever talk about specific changes. But I think even in the public decision, Danny was quite open, and he's done an interview with us since then to kind of say they actually turned the whole experience into a positive, actually, and kind of took a step back to look at their entire brand. What could they keep that really reflected their identity, but what changes could they make going forward to kind of future-proof as much as possible and protect that brand alongside the code to get that balance a bit more correct. And of course, you can all go on their website if you would like to see what their designs look like now. But yeah, we take the advice confidentiality principle pretty seriously.
Yeah, but that's a fair point. Yeah, but to come back to your question, too, it's a bit of a serious point, but it's actually important. But in terms of so if your viewers and listeners go on our website and they want to understand those code rules better, there's guidance on all of the code rules, and also there's, in terms of coming back to the sort of point about Beak and product's actually called Dest, was the one with the sun and the cloud in a sort of anthropomorphized way. If you come back to that, there's a couple of quite interesting reports on our website which are sort of produced to inform the independent complaints panel, and they're produced by a company called Kids Industries. Now, Kids Industries is a pretty interesting company because what they are is marketing experts designing marketing campaigns or advising businesses on how to market for products which can legally be sold to adults for little kids or to young people. So legitimate products and so on, and that's and why that's so important is because the panel wants to understand what are the tricks of that trade, what kind of designs, imagery, cartoons in many cases, what kind of things appeal to people under 18 and obviously to kids, to children. It's not rocket science really. You can see it on any kind of cereal pack in any high street, or loads of other sort of different stuff in the food sector, or toys which are aimed at kids, and the kind of marketing that goes with them. And there are particular kind of tricks of the trade about the types of anthropomorphized figures and cartoons that you get, or bold key lines. And I'm not going to go busking on how you market to kids, but you can see it, you can read all of that in the Kids Industries reports, and that's very instructive. Basically, don't do that stuff. There's lots of do's and don'ts there.
Yeah, the illustrative side, because you walk into any supermarket and everyone, Matt, like you rightly said, is screaming for attention. One way to do it is work with a phenomenal illustrator who has these incredible skills and can genuinely stand out and get noticed. And I think now, to kind of my generation, we have this nostalgic yearn for comic books, which are now graphic novels, and Star Wars, and all the things that we really enjoyed when we were young. And so naturally, you go as a brewery, maybe we should lean into that because our audience are of that age, but technically it would be considered something that did appeal to children. Like, what's the line? There's such a fine line to tread here.
Well, that's
what guidance can you give on the call, on this chat, versus kind of going and reading a big document?
Yeah, you're right. It is such a fine line, and the panel have made decisions in the past where, on exactly that point, looking at the nostalgia point, they've kind of acknowledged in some areas, yes, that might have an appeal to adults from when they were children, but some of those nostalgic elements, we've seen so many things that have been reinvented or brought back and are now cyclical, and they, equally resonate really strongly with children as well. So it's kind of those factors that they'll start to look into. How long ago was a theme, for instance? Has it been brought back since? And so many things have rebooted now. We find time and time again, quite a lot of the time, has been rebooted. And then what's the presentation of it? How much reference does it have in the packaging or in the marketing? And, the guidance that Matt referenced from Kids Industries and how it's informed our guidance as well is that because of that fine line, we've tried to identify areas like colour, characters' names, fonts, flavours, licensing of characters, for instance. These are areas of watch out, but what the panel and the advisory service will always look for is the overall impression. So using any of those areas might not necessarily be problematic in isolation, but almost as a totting up process, the more of them that you use, the closer to that line of acceptability that you are getting to. So it really becomes a fine balancing act, and there are so many precedents again on our website which try to show where that line might be, and it's also for the advisory service to try and help too.
And I suppose then you've got the naming aspect, right? Obviously making it very clear that it is beer in this example. If you had a big bold illustration and it was vibrant, maybe a little bit kiddie, but there was a whacking great beer written across the front of it, does that kind of offset it in a way? Like, can you solve a lot of these problems by making people very clear of the contents of the can?
This is a really good question, because this actually comes up all the time. It's really important to know that no, So those two rules, whether if you're making something clear it's alcoholic, great, you've ticked off that side. But in terms of particular appeal to under 18s, it's about the appeal of the design itself, whether it's clear it's alcohol or not. Something can still particularly appeal to children if you have those design elements, font, colours, a character, that will still potentially particularly appeal to children, even if it's clear it's alcoholic.
Right then. And so let's focus a little bit more on naming. Obviously, it's a boo-boo to not put it's alcohol on the front, but are there any other pitfalls in terms of naming that you see breweries falling into a lot?
Oh, very good question. Not too often on the naming side. I think producers are broadly aware of the rules and the code of practice, and a name is a part of a brand that you really don't want a regulator to come in and touch, essentially. So I do find for names themselves, they do tend to be a bit more mindful, a bit more conservative. That doesn't tend to be where the majority of the problems lie. It's much more in the colour and the artwork side.
Okay, so the naming can still be a literary reference or something that might have come from a child's book in that case.
It was going to be so subjective. It really depends on what the reference is to, how relevant it is to children today. A name can be a problem in and of itself. It would have to be quite a strong breach for a name alone.
There was a good example. It's not a beer, and I don't think we have the photograph of it, but I think the listeners will know immediately what I'm talking about. Hello Kitty wine was a good example of something that was problematic right from the start, really. And actually, interestingly, the producer was based in Italy and really didn't realise that would be a problem. Whether it would, they sort of tried to argue it wouldn't be a problem in Italy, which I seriously question. But the panel didn't like, there was the Hello Kitty symbol on the front of the wine, and it was Hello Kitty wine. So I mean, I think that the name and the picture on the front of the bottle, all of it mixed up, was obviously a particular appeal. Although Hello Kitty's been around a good while, it's still very much appealing to children today as it did it's been around 20-30 years maybe, I don't know.
So you won't see the SpongeBob stout or the Teletubbies tipper coming out anytime soon, I guess.
I wouldn't recommend it, that's for sure.
So team, I think the other thing you talked about, the complaints process, and I think there is that misconception that you and the team are out there hunting for who's done it wrong and slapping them on the back of the wrist. But am I right in understanding that someone raises a complaint, they've seen it on a shelf, and so that gets reported to you?
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
We do have I think I've got a slide. I don't really want to talk through it in massive detail. I'll keep it broad brush. But essentially, most of the complaints that we receive are from members of the public. The Portman Group as ourselves cannot raise a concern ourselves. Sometimes we do receive complaints from competitors, and that is perfectly fine. But if you want to make a complaint as a competitor, you will need to be named. And at that point, some companies choose not to put their complaint forward. So we'll receive a complaint. We've got various checks that we'll do at that point to, for instance, check whether the complaint is in remit. Can we actually take it forward? Do we need to refer it to the ASA? Is the complaint a member of the public, or do they work or have an interest in the alcohol industry? At that point, if it is in remit and we've got a clear idea of what the product is and the imagery, we will then put that complaint to the chair of the independent complaints panel, which Matt has referenced. So the independent complaints panel is made up of 10 lay members. So again, while the Portman Group aren't raising complaints, equally we're not making decisions on the complaints that we receive either. So these are a group of people who are chosen from all different backgrounds to get that broad view of society, ideally.
Would you just say a little bit about where they come from? Do you mind if we do that, Tim?
By all means.
Yeah, I mean, just if I could, sorry to jump in there, Lauren, and I'll let you get back onto your thread. But I mean, it's interesting. Rachel Child's very experienced adjudicator in a number of different fields. She's been formerly on the ASA Council. She's our chair. She's a former head teacher. We've got a former chief nurse from London. We've got a youth entrepreneur, somebody who works with young people in London. We've got a former police licensing officer in the Glasgow area who now works with drug and alcohol rehabilitation in that city, and a whole range of different, right across the United Kingdom. We've got a lawyer, another former teacher, and we got a couple of people who've got some background in the drinks industry, including in marketing at a high level, but no longer working in the industry. So you have a couple of people who have that sort of input and understanding of what legitimate marketing looks like, and have a better and can help inform the panel when they've overstepped the rules. But that's, if you think about it like sort of a jury, really, but it's a sort of hand-picked jury with a bunch of different sort of expertise, from different range of backgrounds that actually help us inform and have a really good decision. And it's a very diverse panel, including sort of younger people as well. So it's a pretty good way of actually making decisions in a common sense way against, as I say, a common sense code, really. So, Laura, sorry to throw you off your track.
No, it's right.
Yeah.
And because of that, because we can't make any decisions that we have through this complaint process, which I mentioned is detailed in the code, all those decisions are taken by the chair. Again, as the secretariat, we have no decision-making power. So sometimes when a complaint is received, we can answer questions about the process, but we can't second guess ultimately what the panel might decide. So at that early stage where we've got the complaint, got the imagery, we'll put that to the chair and we'll say to her, how would you like this complaint to be resolved? And she's got 3 routes that she can take. So the first is to just dismiss the case out of hand. And this is actually something that we introduced relatively recently in the past couple of years, because historically under the Portman Group, when we received a complaint and you could see that the product was absolutely fine, there was no concerns, that would always have to be considered by that full group of people. That producer would have to go through the entire process, which is quite stressful. If you're a small one-man band, that is pretty stressful. And it just, for something that was obviously not a problem, that was placing quite an onus on a producer. So we've slightly changed that, where the chair can now say, it's no problem, there's literally no case to answer here. We'll write to the producer to say, we received this complaint, but the chair has decided that there is no case to answer. Just, that's for your information, and the case will be closed unless the complainant can bring a new form of evidence to suggest why it should go forward. The second option is what we call informal resolution. So the chair, in her considerations, will be looking at, is the case precedent setting? Is it a clear-cut breach of the code? If it's a clear-cut breach of the code, it's clearly problematic, and it's not precedent setting for the industry, and the producer is willing to work with the Portman Group's advisory service, she can then delegate authority to the advisory service to resolve that complaint. So we will try to address the concerns raised by the complainant. What are the concerns that are actually causing the breach under the code? We will work with the producer to say, look, these are the changes we think you need to make. And if the producer says, you know what, we hold our hands up, we got it wrong that time, they can make those changes. The case is closed, and a few case details are published on our website, but there's no press release, there's no publication of that decision. There's just a note on our website that it's happened against this product and the code rules that it was resolved under. And then the third option, if the chair believes a case is precedent setting, it's likely to help the industry going forward to understand, a particular rule, or it's not clear cut that it's actually a breach of the code. That is the instance when it will proceed to formal investigation. At that point, we'll approach the producer and say, got this complaint, now is your chance to put forward your side. They'll do so in writing, the panel will meet, they'll have lots of different information, they'll have guidance, they'll have previous precedent, and they'll make a decision under the code. If they choose to not uphold the complaint, that is it. That is the end of the case. We'll release a press release and publish it on our website, and that's the end of it. If they do decide that they would like to uphold the complaint, that's what we call a provisional decision, and the decision will be written up. That will go back to the producer. So the producer has another opportunity, almost as an appeal, to say, we don't agree with the panel's findings because of X, Y, Z. and it will go back to the panel for them to consider those points, and then it will reach a final decision at that point, and we'll issue a press release, and it will be published on our website. And as Matt mentioned, that's the stage when enforcement might come in, and it will switch to the Portman Group, and we'll try and work with the producer to determine what changes do need to be made to comply with the panel's decision, and what enforcement changes we might need to do.
But it's often worth, if you do find yourself in that situation, Tim, and you've got an upheld decision, it is actually usually, it is worth going to put some more arguments if you've got new arguments about the provisional decision. And we have seen the panel reverse its provisional decision and not uphold a product. So we saw that quite recently. Lervig House Party had a provisional upheld decision, and then the panel heard some further evidence and decided it agreed with the producer and did not uphold that complaint. So it can happen. And then another thing I would just like to add to sort of Laura's a very good overview there, really, is that whilst it's true, we're not like, because of the way that we're funded, we're not like the Advertising Standards Authority, which does proactively bring complaints all the time about advertising that spots, which is a breach of its code, which is very similar, but as I say, for advertising. We can't do that because obviously we're funded by the industry, and that could be anti-competitive. So the way that we have tried to address that and harden that up is to have, every couple of years, we have an independent body which goes out and assesses the market, and it's in a very careful methodology. So it's weighted about the leading markets in each leading products in the markets in each part of the sector, including breweries in this case for beer. And it will assess the market and bring to us complaints or areas where it feels there are concern, and some of those will be generated complaints from that independent auditor. So we can't influence that process, and we can't tell them what to look at, and we can only deal with what they bring to us. So it retains that independence, but it is a proactive look at the market every couple of years to make sure there's a high level of compliance. And we've just recently finished that process at the end of last year. And what it actually found is that 94% of the market was completely compliant, which is a pretty good compliance record, actually. And it did generate a fair number of actual complaints, some of which were upheld. But that was all decided, of course, not by the Portman Group, but by the chair of the panel and then the independent complaints panel. So it's never Laura, myself, and my team who make those decisions. We only put together the evidence. If you think about it, the way I often describe it is it's a bit like the clerks to a court, really. We're there to provide the information to support a case and answer any technical or procedural questions, but we never seek to influence the deliberations of the independent complaints panel or affect in any way their decisions, which are entirely with those 10 people.
That makes sense. And I could see that. I think someone asked me on LinkedIn when they saw the chat was coming out that, of course, because of who's funding and who's involved, is there like hands in back pockets in place? But if there is this independent side of things, it gives people confidence that can't really happen, because you're still being checked to make sure everything's getting looked at.
Well, again, I think that's right, Tim. I think it's really important to understand, because one of the things I heard again when I first joined the Portman Group is the Portman Group is an elite club. The Portman Group sounds sort of stuffy, like a sort of London club, and it's there for the big players and so on. It's emphatically not for the big players. They make their contribution because they fund it, and that's important. And we look to companies to get behind the Portman Group and support it. And as I said right at the outset of the show, if they want to become code signatories and show actively that they support the code, that's great. And a huge number of producers, many of your viewers and listeners will do that, but also retailers, trade associations, pub groups, and so on. Most of the industry really are signed up as code signatories. There's no cost to that, by the way. And then there's a small group of 21 companies who make that extra commitment to support the self-regulatory system, because they think it's so important that the industry shows that it's responsible and that it does the right thing. And they're not all large companies. There's some quite small ones in our membership. And also, crucially, it's the only place where beer, wine, spirits, ready to drink, and cider all come together in one place to get behind the industry and show that it's responsible and doing the right thing. And at the end of the day, that has no cost to the taxpayer, and it's a pretty efficient and effective way of regulating, because it's also capable of change as well, Tim, because I think there have been 6 revisions to the code in the 30 years since it started in 1996. And that's really to take account of changes in society, changes in the way that the industry works, and recognizing that nothing stays the same. And you do have to actually take account of changes. And that's not a trivial matter, changing the code, by the way, because it involves extensive public consultation, and it's a big piece of work. But it's not a static thing that takes years to change through sort of legislation and parliament. It probably takes best part of a year to change the code, and there is a public consultation process. So it's not a trivial process either, but it's much more flexible and quicker than a rigid legislative or statutory regulatory system.
Okay. Laura, I've just noticed the time. We have been rabbiting for a long time, so I'm going to have to bring this to a close in a minute. But one thing that's popped into my mind, Laura, we talk about this process, the complaints process. The brewery has the opportunity to kind of almost come back with a rebuttal why they feel that it might not be accurate. Mm-hmm. And I suppose in something like that, they could go, but so-and-so brewery did this, or there was so-and-so brewery that did that. But maybe they don't want to almost like dob their friends in and all of a sudden realize that they might be pushing them under a bus. Does that happen? If another one gets pulled in as reference, does that then have to be followed up, or what's that system like?
That's a very good question. So it does happen quite a lot when people say, well, all of this is on the market and this is exactly the same. I guess in answer to your question, no, we will not then follow up products that have been referenced by another producer during a complaints process. That they won't then trigger a complaint in and of themselves. We do some proactive work in the advisory service where, we work in the industry, we spend a lot of time looking at products, it's our job. And if we do see something, then we might write to a producer confidentially in the advisory service to say, look, this product's come to our attention. We suggest, you probably want to have a chat with us about X, Y, Z. And then it's actually totally up to the producer whether they want to follow that up. In terms of the complaint response for doing it, it's not something I would recommend, because we've had it a few times. Unbeknownst to a producer, they'll use another product as a defense, not knowing that there might be an existing complaint about that already in the pipeline, and it's just not public yet. I would always say focus on your own product packaging, and that's because it's exactly what the panel do as well. They will not compare it to other things out there. It will be assessed on its own merits, and that's the angle I would encourage a producer to stay to as well.
Yeah, there's another common error that sometimes companies that have been complained about make, which is that they say, we've never had a complaint before, and this is the first time it's ever happened. It's only one person, and that's a mistake really in terms of understanding the code, because one is enough. It's not a numbers game with complaints with the Portman Group. Is a complaint a valid complaint? If it is, then the chair will assess whether she wants it to go down whichever route she chooses, and then it will be assessed, as Laura says, in exactly the same way, on its merits against the code. And in that sense, one person complaining is enough, even if the companies sometimes think that doesn't sound particularly fair. It's because it's the principle that are applying, not the quantity of complaints.
Understood. I suppose that's the first person to actually step up and say something. Other people may have thought similar, but not known the process as well.
You need to actually raise your hand, don't you?
So let's bring this to a close then. I mean, it's been really valuable, and hopefully those who are listening have taken something away from it. But if there is a brewery, they're planning to launch a new product in a month. Where are we sending them? What are the first things that they need to do before it gets out in the world?
Do you want me to?
Yeah, well, it's, the easiest thing is to go and look on the net and find portmangroup.org.uk, and you put that into any search engine, Portman Group will come straight up, and then you'll be able to find our contact details very easily and get in touch. And really, they should do that as soon as possible, shouldn't they, Laura?
Yeah, I mean, there's loads of information they can read on the website. But again, as you've already highlighted, people are busy. They don't have a lot of time. And that's what the advisory service exists for, to give that free, informed advice. That would always be my number one recommendation to producers. It's just send it. You've got nothing to lose by sending it to the advisory service.
And then if you do have more time, our training service is very low cost for small producers. It's very low cost, and it probably takes about an hour. It's a very personal. It's quite an interesting training. It's way more colourful than we've been able to do here today, because you can see some of the products that have been problematic, or those that have been just on the right side of the line, and gives you a much better sense of what works and what doesn't work when it comes to developing products and marketing them. And as I say, that's pretty low cost for small producers, and that's another option you can take to get a really good understanding of the whole code if you've got the time to do that. As Laura says, we recognise people running businesses are busy and have a lot of pressure on them. So but it would probably be an hour well spent and not particularly costly.
Fantastic. Well, I'll make sure that all the links go into the show notes so people can check it out and get involved. All that's left for me to say, Matt and Laura, is thank you so much for your time. It's been a really interesting chat, and I hope everyone's enjoyed it. You had a good time?
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, all of you tuning in and listening, as always, you are phenomenal. You rock. I appreciate each and every one of you tuning into these chats. And stay tuned, because we've got a lot more coming up. Until next time, people, take care. Rock on. That's a wrap on this week's episode of Branding for Breweries. If you got something great from it, hit follow, like, and subscribe on your favorite streaming app. Or even better, leave a review, share it with your brewery pals, or get in touch, because I want to chat to you. Rock on!